She was left at the altar, humiliated before the world. But she didn't break. She vanished. Olivia Bennet became Lillian Carter, a woman forged in betrayal, rebuilt in power. Years later, she returns, not for love, but for revenge, to dismantle the empire of the man who abandoned her, Alexander Harrington. But as secrets unravel and hearts collide, she faces a brutal truth. Is revenge worth losing herself? Where are you watching from? Comment below. And if you love stories of betrayal, redemption, and power, subscribe now. Your next obsession starts here. Olivia Bennet stood at the far end of the grand ballroom, surrounded by towering white roses, her fingers trembling as they clutched the delicate lace of her gown. The air was thick with the scent of champagne and fresh blooms, but all she could hear was the deafening pounding of her heart. The chandeliers above cast golden light across the marble floor, creating an almost ethereal glow. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, the day she became Olivia Harrington, wife of one of the most powerful men in New York. But something felt wrong. Across the room, Alexander Harrington stood tall in his custom tuxedo, his presence commanding as always. His dark hair was immaculately styled, and his sharp blue eyes, ones that had once made her feel safe, now clouded with something unreadable. His phone buzzed against his palm, an incessant sound that cut through the soft murmur of the crowd. Olivia swallowed hard as she took a tentative step forward. "Alex," she called gently, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond. Instead, he glanced down at the screen, his jaw tightening as if he was bracing for something. The guests, an elite gathering of business magnates, celebrities, and high-profile socialites, sensed the shift in the air. Conversations quieted. Murmurs spread through the rows of gilded chairs. Even the string quartet, stationed in the corner, hesitated for a brief second before resuming their elegant melody. Olivia's parents, seated in the front row, exchanged uneasy glances. They knew how treacherous the world of high society could be, how secrets, rivalries, and last-minute revelations could dismantle a person's entire future in a matter of moments. Then, the phone rang again. The shrill sound shattered the silence. Olivia flinched. Alex hesitated for a breath. Too long before finally answering. The moment he brought the phone to his ear, his entire demeanor changed. His broad shoulders tensed, his grip on the device tightening. Olivia couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but she caught the urgency in the tone. A woman's voice, sharp and desperate. The color drained for Alex's face. "Alex," she tried again, her voice cracking. He didn't look at her. He barely even acknowledged she was standing there in front of him, in front of everyone. Instead, he whispered something into the phone, words too soft for anyone else to hear. Then whatever he heard next made him recoil slightly, his entire body going rigid. And then, in the next breath, his grip loosened on her hand. The absence of his touch sent a wave of cold down her spine. "Alex," she pleaded, her pulse quickening, panic rising in her throat like bile. "Who is it?" For a moment, just one fleeting second, she thought he might tell her. That he might look her in the eye and explain whatever was happening. That this wasn't what it looked like. That she wasn't about to be humiliated in front of hundreds of people. But instead, he exhaled slowly and took a step back. "I'm sorry," he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. Then, without another word, without a single backward glance, Alexander Harrington turned on his polished dress shoes and walked away. The grand doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open, and just like that, he was gone. A stunned silence filled the space. For a long moment, Olivia didn't move, couldn't move. It was as if her entire body had locked up, as if her brain couldn't process what had just happened. She was standing at the altar, alone, in her wedding gown, in front of hundreds of people, and the man she loved had just left her. A strangled sound, half a gasp, half a sob, escaped her lips. The whispers started almost immediately. He just walked out. Did she do something? There must be another woman. This is a disaster. Cameras flashed as the press, especially invited by the Harrington family, captured every excruciating second of her humiliation. Her father stood abruptly, his face pale with anger. Her mother pressed a trembling hand to her lips. Olivia's vision blurred. Her breath came too fast, too shallow. She could hear the wedding planner rushing toward her, whispering something about handling the situation, but nothing made sense anymore. Then, her gaze landed on Margaret Harrington, seated in the second row, her expression frozen in something that almost resembled satisfaction. Olivia's chest tightened. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The cold stares, the carefully orchestrated rumors, the way Margaret had always looked at her, not with warmth, but with calculated disdain. This wasn't just a runaway groom. This was a betrayal. As the walls of the ballroom seemed to close in, as the world tilted beneath her, Olivia made a silent vow to herself. One day, Alexander Harrington would regret this. The next morning, Olivia awoke to a nightmare that hadn't ended. It had only grown bigger, uglier, and more merciless. Her phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Calls, messages, notifications from social media. She didn't have to open them to know what they said. The wedding that was supposed to mark the beginning of her perfect life had instead become New York's biggest scandal overnight. The tabloids were merciless. Runaway groom, Alexander Harrington abandons bride at the altar, screamed one headline. Another was worse, gold digger exposed. The real reason Alex left Olivia at the altar. Her stomach turned as she scrolled through the articles. Speculation ran wild. Some claimed she had been cheating, that Alex had discovered the betrayal right before the ceremony. Others painted her as a social climber, a woman who had schemed her way into the Harrington family, only to be discarded once the truth came out. There were even whispers that she had orchestrated the entire thing for attention. Her hands shook as she swiped through the images attached to the articles. Photos of her standing alone at the altar, a look of stunned devastation on her face, a shot of her father gripping her mother's hand, their expressions a mixture of rage and heartbreak, a final, gut-wrenching image of Alex walking away, his posture tense, his face unreadable. Humiliation burned through her veins. Her phone buzzed again, a call from Madeline, one of her so-called friends from the high society circles she had reluctantly learned to navigate during her engagement to Alex. Olivia hesitated before answering, pressing the device to her ear. "Olivia," Madeline breathed, her voice dripping with something between pity and fascination. "Oh my God. I don't even know what to say." "Then don't," Olivia muttered, her throat raw. "I mean, it's also shocking. Are you okay?" Olivia closed her eyes. She could hear the barely contained excitement in Madeline's voice, the way she was likely sitting in some Upper East Side cafe, sipping an overpriced latte, while gossiping about Olivia's downfall. "I have to go," Olivia said, ending the call. She turned off her phone. It wouldn't stop the world from tearing her apart, but at least she wouldn't have to hear it happen in real time. She thought about calling Alex, demanding answers, forcing him to face her and explain himself. But the image of him walking away, the cold finality in his voice when he said, "I'm sorry," echoed in her mind. He wasn't sorry. He hadn't looked back. The pain was suffocating, but worse than the pain was the rage. She barely had time to sit with it before a knock sounded at her apartment door. Olivia stiffened, dread curling in her stomach. Her father stood on the other side, his jaw tight, his eyes dark with fury. "You need to see this," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. He placed his phone on the table and pressed play on a video. A statement from the Harrington family. Margaret Harrington sat poised in front of an elegant fireplace, her expression the perfect blend of disappointment and condescension. "As a mother, all I've ever wanted was the best for my son," Margaret began, her tone carefully measured. "Unfortunately, recent events have confirmed our long-standing concerns about his relationship with Olivia Bennet. We never approved of the match. And while Alexander's decision was difficult, he ultimately did what was right." Olivia's blood ran cold. Margaret continued, subtly painting Olivia as the problem, implying she had never truly belonged in their world, that Alex had made a mistake in never trusting her. Then came the worst part. When asked if Alex had left Olivia for another woman, Margaret paused, then smiled ever so slightly. "I think Alexander's actions speak for themselves," she said. Olivia felt physically ill. The unspoken implication was clear. Yes, there was someone else, and Olivia had been discarded because of it. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "This is what they do," her father muttered, pacing the small living room. "This is how they protect their own. They ruin anyone who doesn't fit their perfect little mold." Olivia knew he was right. The Harringtons weren't just letting Alex walk away from their engagement. They were erasing her, crushing her, ensuring she was nothing but a footnote in their world. Her professional life collapsed just as quickly as her personal one. The next morning, her boss called her into his office. The tension in the room was suffocating as he slid a resignation letter across the desk. "Olivia," he said, his voice full of reluctant sympathy, "you're talented, but we can't afford negative publicity." She had built a solid reputation in marketing. She had worked hard. But none of that mattered now. She wasn't just Olivia Bennet anymore. She was the woman Alexander Harrington had left at the altar. She walked out of the office that day with nothing. No fiancé, no career, and no dignity left to cling to. And then, to add to the final cruelty of it all, the paparazzi found her. She barely made it inside her apartment before the cameras flashed in her face, reporters shouting, demanding comments. Her hand shook as she fumbled with the lock, but before she could close the door, one of them sneered, "Got any comments on Alex's new girl?" Olivia slammed the door. She collapsed onto the floor, breath hitching, hands clenched into fists. For hours, she stayed there, letting the weight of her destruction crush her. Then, as the sky outside darkened, as the echoes of her humiliation settled deep into her bones, something inside her changed. She had spent all day mourning the life she lost. Now, she was done mourning. Olivia wasn't going to be erased. She wasn't going to be a footnote in their story. One day, Alexander Harrington and his entire world would learn the cost of betraying her. And when that day came, she wouldn't be the one left standing in the ruins. They would. The Olivia Bennet the world knew ceased to exist that night. By morning, she had made her decision. She wouldn't stay in New York waiting for the whispers to die down, for the gossip to fade. The city had turned on her, devoured her reputation, and left her in ruins. No one would come to her rescue, not her so-called friends, not her so-called friends, not her so-called friends, not her colleagues, and certainly not Alexander Harrington. So, she erased herself. She packed a single suitcase, left her engagement ring on the nightstand, and walked away from everything. Within days, she canceled the lease on her apartment, sold off what few possessions she had, and withdrew every penny from her bank account. She deleted all social media, changed her phone number, and cut ties with anyone who had once been part of her life. By the time the press realized she was gone, Olivia Bennet was already a ghost. She drifted from city to city, avoiding anything that tied her to her past. A cramped motel in Philadelphia, a rundown studio in Baltimore, a windowless room in a shared apartment in Chicago. She took whatever jobs she could find, waitressing in a greasy diner, cleaning offices overnight, stocking shelves in a convenience store. The work was grueling, the pay barely enough to survive, but she didn't care. She wasn't trying to live. She was trying to endure. At night, exhaustion wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket, but she couldn't sleep. The betrayal haunted her. The image of Alex turning his back on her, the press tearing her apart, Margaret Harrington's carefully placed smirk. It played on repeat in her mind, fueling the slow-burning fire in her chest. Revenge wasn't just an idea anymore. It was a promise. But revenge required power, and power required something she had never truly possessed: wealth, influence, and an empire of her own. So Olivia Bennet died, and Lillian Carter was born. She started small, rebuilding herself from the ground up. With what little money she had left, she enrolled in a short-term business course, cramming financial reports and investment strategies late into the night. She devoured knowledge like a woman starving, learning everything there was to know about markets, branding, and high-stakes finance. By day, she worked as a waitress. By night, she was buried in books and spreadsheets, scribbling plans in the margins of old napkins. Every tip she earned went toward buying textbooks, online courses, anything that could teach her how to navigate the world of the elite, the world that had cast her out. The first real opportunity came when she met Victor Langston, an aging investor in Chicago. He was a quiet man with sharp eyes, a veteran of the business world who saw something in Lillian that no one else did: hunger. One night, as she cleared away the last of the dinner plates at the upscale restaurant where she worked, Victor called her over. "You ask too many questions for a waitress," he remarked, sipping his whiskey. She didn't apologize. She had been listening in on his conversations with clients for weeks, absorbing every piece of financial knowledge she could. "I learn fast," she said instead. He studied her for a long moment before handing her his card. "If you're serious about business, meet me tomorrow morning at my office. 7 sharp." Lillian didn't sleep that night. By sunrise, she was outside his office, dressed in a borrowed blazer, armed with nothing but a notebook and raw determination. Victor tested her relentlessly, gave her impossible problems to solve, threw financial puzzles at her just to see if she would break. But she didn't. She worked harder than she ever had, proving herself day after day. When Victor finally offered her a position as his assistant, she knew. This was her way back. Under his guidance, she gained experience, made connections, learned how to navigate boardrooms instead of ballrooms. And with her first real paycheck, she didn't buy designer clothes or jewelry. She invested. She started small, a microloft in an up-and-coming neighborhood, flipped and sold at a profit. Then another. And another. Slowly but surely, she built her empire. Within 2 years, Lillian Carter wasn't just surviving. She was thriving. By the time she moved back to New York, she was no longer the girl Alex had left behind. She was a force. Her return wasn't a spectacle. There were no cameras, no grand declarations. She slipped back into the city like a shadow, her presence barely noticed. But behind the scenes, she was already making her move. Through carefully structured investments, she began acquiring stakes in Harrington Global, disguising her ownership behind a web of shell corporations and silent partners. Every acquisition was deliberate, every move calculated. She studied the company from the inside out, tracking its weaknesses, identifying its vulnerabilities. And when the time was right, she took the first real step toward her endgame. A private meeting with none other than Alexander Harrington himself. As she stood in front of the towering glass building that bore his family's name, she felt nothing. No fear, no hesitation, no remnants of the girl he had once abandoned. She was here for one reason and one reason only: to destroy him. Lillian Carter stepped into the gleaming lobby of Harrington Global, her heels clicking softly against the polished marble floor. The air was thick with quiet power, the scent of wealth and ambition woven into the very walls. A younger version of herself might have been awed by it, might have hesitated before stepping into this world again. But not today. Today she wasn't Olivia Bennett, the woman Alexander Harrington had left behind. Today, she was Lillian Carter, CEO of Carter Company, a rising force in real estate and private equity. The receptionist greeted her with professional politeness, unaware that the woman standing before her had once been a part of this world in a very different way. "Miss Carter," the woman said, scanning the appointment log. "Mr. Harrington will see you now." Lillian smiled, a calculated, effortless smile, and followed her through the frosted glass doors that led to Alexander Harrington's office. She knew exactly what she was walking into. Over the past 2 years, she had watched his empire from afar, tracking its every move. She knew the numbers. She knew which sectors of Harrington Global were thriving, and which were crumbling under the weight of outdated strategies and poor investments. More importantly, she knew Alex. And she knew he wouldn't recognize her. Not yet. As she stepped inside his office, her first glimpse of him in years sent a strange, unwanted shiver down her spine. He looked the same, and yet different. The sharp-cut suit, the perfectly styled dark hair, the confidence in his posture, all of it was familiar. But there was something else, something off. A tension in his shoulders, a flicker of exhaustion beneath the polished surface. Good. She wanted him vulnerable. Alex rose from behind his desk, offering his hand. "Mims." "Carter," he greeted smoothly, his voice as rich and deep as she remembered. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Lillian took his hand, gripping it firmly, her nails perfectly manicured, her expression unreadable. "The pleasure is mine," she replied. She studied him carefully as they sat across from each other. No recognition. Not even a hint of familiarity in his sharp blue eyes. Perfect. "I understand Carter Company has been making waves in real estate," Alex said, leaning back in his chair. "Your acquisition strategy is aggressive. Smart. A lot of firms are talking about you." She tilted her head slightly, feigning amusement. "Is that your way of saying you're impressed, Mr. Harrington?" A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "I don't impress easily." Lillian leaned forward just a fraction. "Neither do I." For a brief moment, their gazes locked, a silent battle of wills playing out beneath the surface. She could feel the undercurrent of intrigue coming from him, the same way it had years ago when they first met. But this time, she wasn't some wide-eyed woman falling for the charm of a Harrington. She was the one in control. "I'll be honest with you," Alex said, watching her carefully. "Harrington Global is looking for new partnerships. And I think Carter Company could be an interesting addition to our network. Your investments in luxury properties are impressive." Lillian crossed one leg over the other, her expression thoughtful. "Partnerships require trust, Mr. Harrington." "And trust. Well, that can be complicated." A flicker of something passed through his eyes, something she almost mistook for unease. But Alex Harrington didn't do unease. Not unless there was something beneath the surface. "I find trust is built through results," he countered. "And yet," she said smoothly, "one wrong decision can shatter it completely." For the briefest second, something changed in his expression. a tightening of his jaw, a flicker of something deeper, something buried. Did he feel it? That strange pull of familiarity? That echo of a past he thought was dead? She saw the way his fingers drummed lightly against the desk, the way his gaze flickered, just for a second, as if trying to place something just out of reach. But then it was gone. "Well," he said, regaining his composure, "let's see if we can build it then." Lillian smiled. "Let's." They discussed the technicalities of a potential investment deal, but Lillian wasn't really listening. She was watching, calculating, learning his weaknesses. She played her part flawlessly, giving him exactly what he wanted: a brilliant, enigmatic businesswoman with ambition and vision. Someone he could trust. But beneath the surface, she was already laying the foundation for his downfall. By the time she left his office, the first step of her plan was already in motion. She walked through the bustling streets of Manhattan, her mind racing with strategies, contingencies, and the next phase of her attack. She had infiltrated his world once again. And this time, she wouldn't be the one left in ruins. The game had begun. Lillian Carter left Harrington Global's headquarters with a measured, confident stride, but inside, her mind was already racing, calculating the next move. Alexander Harrington had no idea who she really was, and that was exactly how she wanted it. For now. Over the next few weeks, she played her part brilliantly. She subtly wove herself into his world, attending the same industry events, sitting in on private investment meetings, and, most importantly, positioning herself as an indispensable asset. She wasn't overly eager, nor did she allow him to think she was easily impressed. Instead, she was strategic, giving just enough to keep him intrigued, but never too much to let him feel in control. And Alex was intrigued. He started seeking her out, not just in meetings, but at social gatherings. It was never overt, never too obvious, but she noticed the way his eyes found her in a crowded room, the way his gaze lingered just a second too long. It was working. And yet, something unexpected happened. She had anticipated that Alex would be drawn to her. That much was obvious. Men like him always wanted what they couldn't fully understand. But she hadn't expected the way he looked at her. Like she was familiar. Like he was trying to remember something. The first time it happened, they were at a private investor's dinner. The air was thick with the scent of aged wine and expensive cologne, the hum of conversation and clinking glasses filling the opulent ballroom. Lillian had been engaged in discussion with a venture capitalist when she felt it, his gaze. She turned her head just slightly, locking eyes with Alex across the room. For the briefest moment, his expression shifted. Uncertainty, confusion. As if he was trying to place a memory that didn't quite fit. Lillian's pulse quickened. She tilted her head slightly, a subtle, knowing smile, grace in her lips, before turning back to her conversation. Let him wonder. Let him question. A week later, the second moment came. This time, it was during a strategy meeting at a sleek Manhattan high-rise. Lillian sat across from Alex and two other executives. The conversation centered around real estate acquisitions. The meeting was all business, until Alex asked her something seemingly innocuous. "So, Miss Carter," he mused, leaning back in his chair, his fingers lightly tapping against the polished surface of the conference table. "Tell me, where did you get your start?" Lillian knew the question was a test. She met his gaze with perfect ease. "Oh, nowhere remarkable," she said smoothly, offering just enough truth to keep the lie seamless. "I studied business, spent some time in Chicago building my portfolio. The usual path." His lips curved slightly, but there was something calculating in his eyes. "You seem familiar," he admitted after a beat. "Like we've met before." The air between them shifted, charged with an unspoken tension. Lillian didn't blink. She let a small, amused smile touch her lips, tilting her head just enough to let him wonder. "Perhaps in another life," she said, voice soft, purposefully enigmatic. Alex exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking his head as if dismissing the thought. But she saw it. The flicker of doubt, the unease. It was a dangerous game she was playing. But that was what made it so intoxicating. The final confirmation that her plan was working came on a crisp autumn night at a charity gala in the Upper East Side. She arrived in a stunning, floor-length white gown, not identical to the wedding dress she had once worn, but close enough to stir ghosts in the right minds. The reaction was instantaneous. She felt it the moment she stepped into the ballroom. The shift in the air, the way heads turned, the soft gasps from those who had been there that day. And then there was Alex. He had been mid-conversation with a senator when he saw her. His words faltered. His posture stiffened. For the first time, she saw genuine shock cross his features. He didn't know why. He didn't know how. But something about her was pulling at his memory, unraveling something buried. Lillian approached him with effortless grace, accepting a flute of champagne from a passing waiter. Alex recovered quickly, forcing a polite smile as she drew near. "You clean up nicely, Mr. Harrington," she murmured, taking a slow sip of her drink. He studied her, his gaze sharp, assessing. "And you," he said, voice quiet, unreadable, "you look striking." Lillian merely smiled. Let him stare. Let him wonder. This was only the beginning. The game had shifted. Alexander Harrington was no longer just intrigued by Lillian Carter. He was haunted by her. She could see it in the way his gaze lingered too long when he thought she wasn't looking, in the way he hesitated when speaking to her, as if his subconscious was screaming at him to remember something that refused to surface. And she used it. Every interaction was carefully orchestrated. Just enough familiarity to keep him chasing a ghost, just enough distance to keep him wanting more. It was intoxicating, watching him unravel piece by piece. It all came to a head one evening at an exclusive Harrington Global Investors event. The venue was a sleek rooftop terrace overlooking the glittering Manhattan skyline, the city stretching out in every direction like a sea of golden fire. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, the scent of expensive cigars and aged whiskey mingling under the soft glow of string lights. Lillian arrived late on purpose. When she stepped out of the elevator, every head turned. She wore a deep crimson gown, a deliberate contrast to the wedding, white dress that had stunned Alex weeks before. If white had been meant to haunt him with the past, red was a warning of the future. Alex spotted her instantly. She saw his body tense, his fingers tightening around his glass of bourbon as his conversation with a group of executives faltered. Lillian didn't approach him first. She let him come to her. And he did. Minutes later, she felt his presence before she even turned around. A familiar heat at her back, the subtle shift in the air as he stepped closer than was socially necessary. "You're late," he murmured. His voice was smooth, but there was something just beneath it, tension, curiosity, maybe even frustration. Lillian turned slowly, letting her gaze flick up to meet his. "I wasn't aware I was on a schedule." His lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "No, but I'm starting to think you like making an entrance." She didn't deny it. Instead, she reached for a flute of champagne from a passing waiter and took a slow sip, her eyes never leaving his. He exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "You really do remind me of someone." The word sent a dangerous thrill through her, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, feigning amusement. "Should I be flattered or concerned? Alex studied her, something unreadable flickering in his gaze. Neither, just. Lillian smiled, taking another sip of champagne before glancing around the terrace. I hear Harrington Global has been making some bold moves lately, expanding into new markets, high-risk ventures. A flicker of surprise crossed his face before he quickly masked it. I wasn't aware you kept such a close watch on my company. She let out a soft, knowing laugh. I keep an eye on all my investments, Mr. Harrington. For the first time, something like suspicion flickered across his features. It was subtle, barely there, but she saw it. He didn't know why she felt so familiar. He didn't know how she had slipped into his world so seamlessly. But she knew the doubt had begun to creep in. Good. Let him wonder. Let him unravel. By the end of the night, Alex wasn't just intrigued. He was obsessed. And that was exactly what she wanted. The cracks in Harrington Global had already been there. Lillian just needed to widen them. For the past few months, she had meticulously studied the company's financials, its structure, its vulnerabilities. Every empire had weak spots, and Alex's was no exception. And now, it was time to strike. Her first move was subtle. Through a network of third-party investors and shell corporations, she began offloading shares of Harrington Global at strategic intervals, just enough to create whispers of instability in the market. The stock price wobbled, nothing catastrophic, but enough to make cautious investors nervous. At the same time, she manipulated whispers within the business world. Carefully placed rumors about internal mismanagement, over-leveraged investments, and tension within the Harrington board began circulating through the right circles. It started slow. A doubt here, a hesitation there. And then the panic set in. The media picked up on the uncertainty. Financial analysts began questioning Harrington Global's strategy, and before Alex even realized what was happening, the company was under siege. Lillian watched it unfold with clinical precision, never once revealing her hand. But Alex wasn't blind. She saw the frustration in his eyes at meetings, the way he checked his phone more frequently, the tense set of his jaw as he struggled to put out fires he didn't fully understand. She had made him fight shadows, and he didn't even know she was the one holding the match. And then, one evening, he called her. It was unexpected. They had always met through scheduled business engagements, never in personal settings. But at 11:47 p.m., as she sat in her penthouse, reviewing the latest financial reports on Harrington Global's spiraling stock, her phone buzzed. Alexander Harrington. She let it ring 3 times before answering. Mr. Harrington, she greeted smoothly, as if she hadn't been anticipating this moment. To what do I owe the pleasure? At this hour? For the first time since she had returned to New York, his voice wasn't its usual polished, controlled self. You said something to me the other night, he said, his tone edged with suspicion. You said you keep an eye on all your investments. Lillian leaned back in her chair, twirling the stem of her wine glass between her fingers. Yes, I did. Silence. Then. Are you invested in Harrington Global? She smiled to herself. There it was, the first real trace of doubt. I have many investments, she replied, deliberately vague. Lillian. The sound of her name on his lips sent an unwanted shiver down her spine. But she didn't let it show. What exactly are you asking me, Alex? Another pause. Longer this time. She could almost hear him piecing things together, trying to connect dots that refused to form a clear picture. Nothing, he finally muttered, but the hesitation in his voice told her everything she needed to know. He didn't trust her. Good. Because soon he wouldn't trust anyone. The moment Alex Harrington hung up the phone, Lillian knew she had gotten under his skin. She imagined him pacing the polished floors of his penthouse, drink in hand, staring out at the glittering Manhattan skyline while questions churned in his mind. Who was she? Why did she feel so familiar? And, most importantly, what was she after? It was only a matter of time before paranoia set in. And she wasn't going to give him a moment to breathe. The perfect distraction. A week later, Lillian made sure Alex saw her exactly where she wanted him to. The event was a private art auction, an intimate gathering of New York's wealthiest. The kind of place where deals were whispered over champagne, where people pretended they weren't constantly watching their competitors. Lillian arrived late, ensuring all eyes were on her when she stepped into the dimly lit gallery. Alex was already there. She could feel his gaze before she even turned her head. He stood near a modern sculpture, dressed in his usual tailored perfection, but there was something different. A tension in his posture, a stiffness in his expression. He was watching her, studying her. Perfect. She let him wait. She made conversation with an art collector, laughed at something a hedge fund manager whispered in her ear, sipped her wine as if she wasn't aware that Alexander Harrington was unraveling from across the room. And then, finally, she turned to him. Their eyes locked. Lillian smiled, slow, deliberate. And then she walked away. The cracks in the empire. While Alex was busy chasing a ghost, Harrington Global was bleeding. Her carefully orchestrated sell-off had created a ripple effect. One nervous investor led to another, and soon, confidence in Alex's leadership was waning. Bankers started calling. Clients hesitated. The stock price, once stable, began its slow, agonizing descent. And Alex was too distracted to see it coming. Instead, he was chasing her. The breaking point. The confrontation came 3 nights later. Lillian had just stepped out of her car in front of her high-rise building when she heard his voice. Lillian, Lillian. She turned slowly, feigning mild surprise as she met Alex's storm-filled gaze. He was waiting for her on the sidewalk, dressed in a dark suit. His tie loosened just enough to suggest that he hadn't meant to come here, but had, anyway. He looked, unraveled. That was new. "Mr. Harrington," she said smoothly, closing her car door. "What an unexpected surprise." Alex stepped closer, his jaw tight. "Who the hell are you?" Lillian tilted her head slightly, letting a slow, amused smile spread across her lips. "I'm exactly who I say I am." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, clearly trying to contain whatever was boiling inside him. "Don't do that," he muttered. "Don't act like we don't know each other." The word sent a thrill through her. He knew. He didn't understand how or why yet, but he knew. Lillian took a step closer, closing the space between them just enough to watch his pulse jump at his throat. "Maybe," she said softly, "you should be asking yourself why you didn't recognize me sooner." For the first time in years, Alexander Harrington had no words. And that silence? It tasted like victory. The moment stretched between them, heavy and electric. Alex Harrington stood frozen on the sidewalk, his usually sharp mind clouded with confusion, suspicion, and something dangerously close to recognition. Lillian could almost see the puzzle pieces clicking into place in his head. The way his gaze flickered over her face, searching for something just out of reach. She could have let him suffer in that uncertainty a little longer, let him drown in not knowing. But she wanted more. She wanted to see the exact moment he broke. Lillian took a slow step forward, closing the space between them, her voice soft, almost gentle. "Say my name, Alex." His breath hitched. She saw it. The way his hands clenched into fists at his sides, the way his jaw tightened as he fought against the storm raging inside him. And then, finally, recognition hit him like a blow to the chest. His eyes widened, disbelief crashing over his features like a tidal wave. Olivia. Hearing her old name spill from his lips sent a sharp thrill through her. But she didn't flinch. She didn't waver. She only tilted her head, letting the silence hang between them, watching him unravel. Alex let out a breath that was almost a laugh. But there was no humor in it. Only shock, frustration, and something else she couldn't quite name. You're alive. Lillian arched a brow. Were you hoping I wasn't? He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply, his expression a war zone of emotions. No. He stopped, shaking his head like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. You disappeared. You made me disappear. The words burned on the tip of her tongue, but she swallowed them down. She wasn't here to reminisce about the past. She was here to watch him fall. I had no reason to stay, she said instead, her voice cool, detached. Alex's throat worked as he swallowed, his eyes scanning her face as if seeing her for the first time. And in a way, he was. The last time he had seen her, she had been a shattered woman in a wedding dress, left humiliated in front of the world. Now, she was standing before him as someone entirely new. Stronger, sharper, untouchable. His voice dropped lower, rough with something she didn't dare name. Why are you back? Lillian smiled, slow and deliberate. Wouldn't you like to know? She turned, walking toward the entrance of her building, leaving him standing there in the cold, his world spinning off its axis. She didn't look back. She didn't have to. Alex Harrington was already falling. Alex Harrington didn't sleep that night. For hours, he sat in his penthouse, his glass of bourbon untouched, his mind racing with memories that refused to stay buried. Olivia Bennett. She wasn't a ghost from his past. She was here, alive, thriving, and standing in front of him, with a name that wasn't hers and a gaze that burned right through him. She had changed. Everything about her was different. The way she carried herself, poised, deliberate, powerful. The way she spoke, controlled, sharp, unreadable. But her eyes, those were the same. And they had looked at him tonight with something colder than hatred, with indifference. That was what rattled him most. He had expected anger, expected fire. But she had looked at him as if he were nothing. And that was unacceptable. The hunt for answers. By morning, Alex had his assistant pull everything on Lillian Carter. But she was a ghost. Her official records were clean, too clean. Business ventures in Chicago, a perfectly crafted professional history, investments that seemed to appear out of nowhere. It didn't make sense. How had she rebuilt herself so completely? How had she come back without a single trace Olivia Bennett left behind? And more importantly, why? Why go through all the effort? Why return to New York, to the very world that had shattered her? It wasn't coincidence. It was intentional. And that realization sent a dark, unsettling feeling curling through his chest. The meeting that changed everything. 2 nights later, they met again. This time, he was the one who made sure of it. Lillian had no choice but to attend the emergency Harrington Global Board meeting. The company was still bleeding from the financial chaos she had orchestrated, and she had been too involved in recent investments to avoid suspicion now. So when she entered the sleek conference room, poised and unreadable, Alex was waiting. Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment, the world narrowed to just them. Lillian took her seat without hesitation, crossing her legs, effortlessly composed. Alex studied her, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. I think we need to have a conversation. She arched a brow.
We're having one now?
He leaned forward slightly. A real one. Lillian didn't flinch. She only smiled, but he saw the flicker of warning in her eyes. Whatever she was doing, she wasn't done. And neither was he. Because if there was one thing Alex knew now, without a shadow of a doubt, Lillian Carter hadn't come back to New York to win. She had come back to destroy. The moment the board meeting ended, Alex made his move. Lillian had barely pushed back her chair when he was already standing, his gaze locked onto hers with a quiet intensity that promised no escape. "Stay," he said, his voice smooth but firm. A command, not a request. The other executives filtered out, throwing glances between them, sensing the charged energy in the room. The tension was palpable, suffocating. Lillian exhaled slowly, tilting her head, unbothered, unshaken. "Is this the part where you demand answers, Alex?" His lips pressed into a thin line. "No, this is the part where you give them." She let out a soft laugh, crossing her arms as she leaned back in her chair. His jaw flexed, his patience fraying. "Then I'll find them myself." That was the problem. He would. Lillian had crafted this game too carefully to let him rip it apart now. She tapped her nails against the table, considering her next move. Then, with deliberate ease, she stood and stepped toward him, her heels clicking against the polished floor, closing the space between them just enough to make him tense. Her voice was soft, but it cut like glass. "You don't like not knowing, do you?" Alex's gaze darkened. "You think this is a game," he muttered. She smiled. "I know it is." A beat of silence, heavy, stifling. Then he took a slow step forward, a predator meeting his match. "Who are you really, Lillian?" he murmured. "Or should I say, Olivia?" Her breath caught for a split second. It was so small, so infinitesimal, but Alex saw it. And that was his victory. She turned, moving toward the door with measured elegance, as if she was the one walking away with the upper hand. But just before she left, she paused, glancing at him over her shoulder. "I hope you're ready, Alex," she murmured, her voice a whisper of a threat. "Because this time, I won't be the one losing." And then she was gone, leaving Alex standing alone, with the sinking realization that whatever was coming next, he might not survive it. The storm had finally broken. Harrington Global was on the brink of collapse, its stock price plummeting, investors pulling out, and the once unshakable empire teetering on the edge of ruin. And behind it all, Lillian Carter. Or rather, Olivia Bennett. The truth had finally surfaced, crashing down on Alex Harrington with the force of a hurricane. The woman he had abandoned at the altar had returned, not as a victim, but as the architect of his downfall. He should have been furious. He should have been plotting his retaliation. But all he could think about was the look in her eyes when she walked away from him that night. Not hatred, not vengeance. Something emptier. The last confrontation. He found her at the townhouse. The one she had spoken about long ago, during whispered late-night conversations he had never forgotten. She was already waiting when he arrived, standing near the window, watching the rain as if she had known he would come. Alex stepped inside, closing the door behind him, the sound echoing in the hollow space between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, quietly, he said, "Does destroying me make you happy?" She didn't turn around, but he saw the way her hands clenched at her sides. He took a step closer. "Because if it does, congratulations, you've won." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Is that what you think this is?" Alex exhaled sharply. I don't know what this is anymore, Olivia. At that, she finally turned to face him. And for the first time since her return, he saw it. The cracks in her armor, the exhaustion, the weight of it all pressing down on her just as heavily as it pressed down on him. I wanted to watch you suffer, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, for what you did to me, for what you did to me, for the way you left me there like I was nothing. Alex closed his eyes for half a second, a memory slicing through him like a blade. I believed a lie, he murmured, his voice raw. And I didn't fight for you. That will haunt me for the rest of my life. Silence. Then, a tremor in her breath. He took another step toward her, slow, careful. If you ever saw Emily again, she had once asked him, back when she was still hiding in the shadows, what would you do? Now, here she was. And this was his answer. He reached for her, hesitantly, as if afraid she would vanish. But she didn't move. His fingers brushed against hers, and when she didn't pull away, something inside him cracked wide open. I don't care about the company, he murmured. I don't care about anything but this. She let out a shaking breath. His jaw tightened. I already have. Her lips parted, but no words came. Then, finally, she made her choice. Lillian Carter stepped forward. Not to strike, not to wound, but to fall into him. The kiss tasted of tears and rain and all the years they had lost. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a promise. But it was a beginning. And for the first time in years, they weren't fighting against each other. They were facing forward. Together. Together. The lesson behind the story. Revenge is a fire that burns both ways. Lillian Carter, once Olivia Bennett, thought she would find satisfaction in watching Alexander Harrington suffer in dismantling the empire that had once crushed her. But in the end, she learned a painful truth. Destroying someone else doesn't always heal you. Power, wealth, and even retribution could never erase the betrayal, the heartbreak, the years lost. She had built herself into an untouchable force, but at what cost? The woman she became was strong, yes, but also lonely, burdened by the very battle she had chosen to fight. Alex, too, learned a lesson of his own. A mistake made in fear, a betrayal fueled by doubt. Those things don't just disappear. They leave scars, and sometimes those scars come back in ways you never expect. He had allowed himself to be manipulated, blinded by the expectations of his world. He had let go of the one thing that truly mattered, and in the end, he nearly lost her forever. But here's the truth. Forgiveness isn't about letting someone else off the hook. It's about setting yourself free. Lillian's final choice wasn't about Alex. It was about herself. She could have held on to her pain forever, let it define her. But instead, she chose something harder, letting go. Because true power, it isn't in revenge. It's in rising above. Where are you watching from? We'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Comment below and let us know. And if you love stories of betrayal, redemption, and second chances, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more. Your next favorite story is just one click away.